All right, so thank you all very much for joining us for the Islamic Theology Symposium. And we at this event have four presenters from four different traditions of Islamic thought, each presenting a different interpretation of what we could broadly call Islamic theology. And our first presenter, and we're very happy to have him, is Dr. Yasser Qadhi. And Dr. Qadhi is a lecturer and Islamic orator who's authored several books about Islam. He's actually a very popular speaker in many Muslim circles in the US, Canada, England, and Australia. He comes from Houston, Texas. He was educated in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and also at the University of Houston. And then he studied at the University of Medina, and then he completed a PhD in Islamic Studies from Yale University. And he's currently the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Rhodes College and the Dean of Academic Affairs at the Al-Maghrib Institute and resident scholar of the Memphis Islamic Center. And although to be fair, some of this could be updated, but we'll see. I think now you're running the Islamic Seminary of America, so that's an exciting initiative as well. And Dr. Qadhi, we're very happy to have you. I will unshare my screen, and you have about 25 minutes.
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, welcome, and I appreciate the fact you give me the opportunity to speak about this topic. By the way, I'm no longer at Rhodes. I resigned. I'm now in Dallas, and I'm the Dean of the Islamic Seminary of America. So we have very short time, and as most professors or lecturers do, I hijacked another PowerPoint. This is not a PowerPoint I had time to prepare specifically for you guys, unfortunately. So there's going to be a little bit of an overlap or a foray into other topics that we're not going to be discussing. But let us begin very quickly. So many of you should be familiar with the fact that there are three really broad paradigms when it comes to pre-modern Islamic theology. You have the falasifa, the philosophers of Islam, people like Al-Kindi and Avicenna. You have the people of Kalam, and then you have what is called nowadays Salafism, Hanbalism, Proto-Sunnism, Wahhabism. These are all various strands within this one strand, if you like. For the purposes of this slide, we'll just call it Hanbalism, or Atharism is another term for it. And there's marked differences between these three paradigms. The falasifa, of course, their understanding is that rational thought will give us ultimate truths, and therefore truths are supra-scriptural per se, that the Quran basically is not necessarily bringing forth radically new or different. You know, the intellect is valid enough to derive the fundamental core knowledge that is required. And of course, their understanding of God, as I'm sure you've understood by now with Professor Andani and others, is that technically God transcends any attribute, including even that of existence. Like, you don't really describe God except to convey an idea to somebody else. Otherwise, in actual existence, you know, the God himself is not described with any predicative attribute. Of course, the people of Kalam are totally non-Sunni Kalam. Then you have Sunni Kalam. So non-Sunni Kalam is where it began. And the reason why they're not Sunnis is because they don't affirm predestination the way Sunnis do, and also because they don't take the corpus of the Sunnah Hadith literature. So you have the Mu'tazila, you have the Zaydis, you have the Imamis, the Twelvers, you have the Ibadis. All of them are non-Sunni Kalam. And Kalam was founded as a rational defense of the faith. Hence, there are many truths that are scriptural that must be believed in, even if the intellect doesn't understand them. And there is a methodology of how to understand the attributes. There's a spectrum from the far right to the far left within the people of Kalam. But by and large, their version of God allows for the people of Sunni Kalam some attributes, like 7 eternal attributes. And for the Mu'tazilites, basically, God is characterized by these attributes in a way that, if you phrase it properly, God knows by knowing that is him. God hears by hearing that is him. But essentially, God does know and hear the way that we understand it in a manner that befits him. God has these qualitative attributes, but not individual attributes. And so the problem really became one of semantics, i.e., how do you best phrase that God has these attributes? But by and large, Sunni kalam and non-Sunni kalam, accepted the fact that God knows us, hears us, is aware of us, we pray to him, we invoke him. It's just a matter of which attributes are we going to affirm directly, such as the Sunni kalam you're going to hear affirm 7, or the Maturidis affirm 8, and the rest of them are understood to be metaphorical. So there's a spectrum of interpretation. We're going to zoom over that. I'm here talking to you about the last strand, which is Atharism or Hanbalism. And this is the only strand that rejected these types of dialectic theologies known as kalam, and of course the rational inquiries of the Falasifa. They are scripturally fideistic, and by this I mean that they stick with the text of the Quran and Sunnah, the Sunnah of course of the Prophet, peace be upon him. They stick with the verbal message given, the attributes that are found in the Quran and Sunnah. All scriptural attributes are affirmed without a knowledge of modality. One does not go beyond the scripture. There's an innocent, there's a simplistic affirmation. If God says it, he knows best. If the Prophet told us, well, we have to believe in him. And we don't get involved in understanding how these attributes exist. Now I'm going to come back to this point, but for now let's quickly move on. From the perspective of the Hanbalites or the Atharis, from perspective of this last category, whose main propagator is Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah is the main figure that looms. Literally, he eclipses everybody else before and after him. From the perspective of Ibn Taymiyyah, kalam and falsafa are basically two sides of the same coin. You have to understand this point, that from the perspective of the Atharis or the Hanbalis, it's just a matter of interpretation, a degree of selectively choosing various axioms and principles. But in reality, there is no clear distinction between kalam and falsafa. Same continuum. And from their perspective, it's just a matter of where each group puts itself on this spectrum. And this is, of course, key to their final verdict on what is to be done with kalam and falsafa. Now, the notion of proving God's existence is radically different from the Hanbalites, Atharis, to the kalam and the philosophers, the falasifa. For Ibn Taymiyyah and for the Hanbalis and Atharis, you don't need to go into detail proving God's existence. Actually, God's existence is known naturally. There's an innate disposition already in man called the fitra, which is a term found in the Quran and Sunnah, in which Ibn Taymiyyah has an entire epistemology of the fitra, in which he says that the fitra is imprinted divinely into the child before the child comes into existence. Hence, the child grows up and knows innately, without the need to be taught, various knowledges. And of the knowledge that the child knows is that there is one God, and that God is all perfect and knowing in all the majestic attributes, and that there is the desire to revere and to worship God. This is innate in mankind, Muslim or non-Muslim, doesn't matter. Everybody's born with that same innate disposition. And that innate disposition, the fitrah, if left uncorrupted, if the child is a Muslim, well, the child will then become a good Muslim and is going to believe in Islam. If the child is not a Muslim, but then sees Islam when the child is an adult, when the child hears about Islam as a young man or woman, and their fitrah is pure, well, then automatically they're going to recognize the truth of the revelation, because the fitrah, God's embedded consciousness in man, is directly in harmony with God's revelation. It fits like a hand to a glove. So there's a harmonious extension of the fitrah. Revelation, the message of the prophets, is a natural extension of the divinely gifted innate disposition of mankind. Hence, intuitively, the pure heart shall recognize the veracity of the prophets of God. However, the fitrah may be corrupted. It's going to be corrupted by society, by parents who forced another religion, or by insincerity. And if the fitrah is corrupted, then perhaps, potentially, the person, when he or she hears about Islam, will not recognize the truth of revelation. As for the knowledge of God, God is known to us from the fitrah directly, and also by obvious self-evident inferences from the world around us. You know, you simply examine the creation, like the Quran has many verses. Look around, do you see any flaw? You know, is there any disharmony in the universe itself? Where did man come from? There's a verse in the Quran, did man create himself? You know, where did you come from? There must be a creator above you, or you know, greater than you, who created you. So the evidences for the existence of God are primarily the fitrah. And if there is a need if you need to, if the fitrah has been corrupted, then you may prove the existence of God by self-evident, obvious inferences from the world around us, from consciousness, from whatever it might be. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that complex arguments for the existence of God are, number one, not the primary focus of the prophets and theology. God did not reveal the books or send the prophets in order to give these complex proofs for his existence. Number two, they're never effective. People who want to reject God are going to do so from spiritual arrogance and not because these complex things are going to convince them otherwise. And number three, Ibn Taymiyyah argued that these complex mechanisms of proving God's existence inevitably have acts within them, corollaries that necessarily clash with the nature of God, with the divine revelation, right? And so Ibn Taymiyyah was a harsh critic of all of the arguments of the existence of God that are commonly found in Avicenna, in Maimonides, in Thomas Aquinas, which is of course coming straight out of Ibn Sina, of all the people of Kalam. And of course, this is the Kalam cosmological argument, which I'm not going to go into. You must have done it in other seminars in this module of yours. But the point being that the Kalam cosmological argument was harshly critiqued by the Atharis, by Ibn Taymiyyah, and they viewed this argument as being so according to Ibn Taymiyyah, the broad corollaries or the broad premises are valid, but in order to validate these broad premises, you must make certain axiomatic statements that are not axiomatic. You assume them to be axiomatic, and then you apply them to God, Ibn Taymiyyah would charge his opponents. And you think that God cannot be as he described himself because of what you believed to be these axiomatic principles in order to prove your Kalam cosmological argument. And in the other class that I taught, which I'm not going to be able to go into because of time, but I mean, I gave my other students that I'm teaching some examples of this, the corollaries of the Kalam cosmological argument, that the world consists of bodies within which subsist accidents. The accidents cannot exist by themselves. They must exist within a body. Accidents are created and temporal, like the Asharite says, they do not last 2 time frames. Therefore, if accidents are created and temporal, then the bodies that house them must also be created and temporal. And if, therefore, any entity has an accident, then by the Kalam cosmological argument, that entity be a body, and that body must be created. And bodies occupy space, and they have a direction and are composed, they're compounded, right? So these are principles that the Kalam cosmological argument uses to prove the existence of God. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah did not find each and every of these principles problematic per se. He found them problematic if they were going to be applied against God's attributes. According to this strand of Islam, the Athari strand, Ibn Taymiyyah strand, that these notions of trying to divide existence into bodies and accidents, and then trying to assume that if there's an accident, this automatically implies a body, and then reading the Quranic language about God's attributes, and then saying, oh, well, that can't be applied to God, because if this were to be applied to God, that would be an accident. And if it is an accident, then axiomatically, God must be created if we were to follow through with the Kalam cosmological argument. For Ibn Taymiyyah, all of this is null and void. You do not apply the Kalam cosmological argument against the divine text, which is the Quran itself. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, there's a number of key principles when it came to the divine attributes. First and foremost, and again, this is from me, I'm just summarizing, there's obviously so much. Ibn Taymiyyah in particular emphasized and specialized in the attributes issue, and he wrote many, many volumes defending his paradigm. And they're still being interpreted to this day. I'm sure Professor Khalil will mention some of the degrees of interpretation. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, a number of things to take into account. I've mentioned 4 of them. Number one, the purpose of language, that the language is meant to convey ideas. And so when God says X, then there's a reason why he's saying it. And if X is understood by the people of revelation, by the people who speak the language in a certain manner, well then, God knows best, God speaks the best, and God has the best intentions. These are 3 things he would always mention, that if you want to reject somebody for something he or she says, it's got to be one of 3 things. They don't know, they intentionally want to deceive, they're not eloquent, they don't know how to speak. And he goes, in all 3 of these, God is always, coming out the top. He is the most truthful. He knows, more than, he knows obviously everything, and he is the most eloquent. So on what basis would you reject the words that he himself chose? He would also bring up the issue of what, similar to this, but what is the intent of God? When God is describing himself with all of these adjectives, with all of these concepts and ideas. Well, then what is the purpose of the Quranic revelation except to understand it in a particular manner? Also, one of the key points of the Athari school is that the Athari school, the reason why they're called Salafis in our times is because they have this theological notion that the Salaf, or the first generations, are the best generations. And so these are the generations of the companions and those that came after them for three. So there's this notion of three. The reason why it's three is because of a prophetic tradition or hadith. So these three generations, the first 170, 100, 200 years, are considered to be role models in terms of piety, not in terms of technology. We're not Amish, the people that are following this data. They say we're not, Luddites rejecting technology. Rather, in terms of piety, in terms of Islamic law, in terms of theology, we will turn to these generations. And it is well known and understood, and nobody denies this, that the earliest batches of scholars in the Sunni tradition were clearly not sympathetic to Kalam. Everybody knows Kalam was introduced later on. The first Sunni mutakallim is Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari or Ibn Kullab, if you want to, and they go back way after the first three generations. And so how can you say that Sunni Kalam is valid when the best of generations themselves, were clearly not on that wavelength? And then another point that he brings, which I've already hinted at, the foreignness of Kalam epistemology. For Ibn Taymiyyah, Falsafa is coming straight out of Neoplatonic thought, Plotinus, Aristotle, Plato. The Kalam tradition is watered down Falsafa, Philo, John of Damascus. For Ibn Taymiyyah, this is not, we don't take foreign epistemologies and then use them as trump cards against the divine revelation. God did not speak to us in a language that was meant to be understood by Neoplatonic axioms. And so for him, the foreignness of this entire epistemology, and again, remember, for the Hanbalis and Atharis, Kalam and Falsafa really are, the same bubble, the same, circle, if you like. It's just a matter of, or I should say the same spectrum. It's just a matter of degrees of interpretation. Ibn Taymiyyah would always say that God knows best. We are not required to understand how the attributes exist. We simply affirm the attributes. And obviously, one key point, which is not on your slides because I didn't have a slide for you guys. A key point of Atharism, which has also been adopted by Sunni Kalam, a key point of Atharism is the notion of Balkafa. And if you want to write this down, Balkafa, B-A-L-K-A-F-A. And Balkafa means we affirm the attributes without a modality, without howness. So God has hearing. How does he hear? We don't ask, but he hears. God knows. How does he know? We don't ask, okay? God has risen over the throne. How has he risen over the throne? We don't ask, we don't know, and we're not required to know. We are required to believe in what the Quran says. So this is Ibn Taymiyyah's key principles when it comes to the doctrines. Now, in order to be consistent, and with this point I'll finish because I know I have only a few minutes of Q&A. In order to be consistent, Ibn Taymiyyah, okay, so 10 minutes left. Okay.
Yeah, you have 10 minutes. You have 10 minutes even for presenting. So don't worry, you're good.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Okay. So that's great. So in order to be consistent, Ibn Taymiyyah and the Athari school did not make any distinction between any attribute that is found in the Quran or in the authentic traditions of the Prophet, because they said that to divide attributes into different types of categories itself is arbitrary. It is something that is coming out of, Kalam epistemology, what defines an accident, what doesn't, right? And so they reject this notion, same consistent principle for all of the attributes. Therefore, those attributes that are meaning-based, knowledge, hearing, life, power, are understood exactly like those attributes that for our minds might deem to be a little bit more anthropomorphic. For example, the Quran mentions that God created Adam with both of his hands. The duality is mentioned in the Quran. The Quran mentions that, the face of your Lord shall be beaming. So wajhu rabbik is mentioned in the Quran. And so obviously, this language was obviously far more problematic. The Quran mentions in 7 verses, God has risen over the throne. Istawa ala al-arsh. What does it mean he's risen over the throne? So for this strand of Islam, we will stick to the wordings of the Quran, the wordings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and we're not going to delve into the howness. It's not a part. In fact, famously, one of the icons of Sunni Islam, Imam Malik, responded that to ask questions about how God does so is a religious innovation and heresy. We're not going to go there. We're simply going to affirm the meaning. Now, the key point, the literal meaning of these words is conceptualized by mainstream Atharis. Pause your footnote. As with all movements, there's a strand, and there's no doubt some of the strands of Atharism, such as Abu Ya'la, for example, which maybe Professor Khalil will talk a little bit about, and others were clearly far more anthropomorphic than Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah is actually coming centrist Athari. And then you had those that were more on the rationalistic side of the Athari creed as well, such as Ibn Qudama and Ibn Aqil. So Atharism is, as with all movements, a strand. Ibn Taymiyyah is somewhat centrist when it comes to the attributes. And Ibn Taymiyyah says that if God says that he's risen over the throne, we understand the concept of rising, but we're not going to let our imagination go into what it means. And any word that is not mentioned in the Quran or in the traditions of the Prophet, we shall remain silent about. So when his enemy said, do you mean that God moves? Ibn Taymiyyah would say, motion is not mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah. I'm not going to say anything about motion. I'm not going to say he moves above, he moves down. I'm going to say exactly what the Quran says, and which is the Arabic istawa ala al-arsh, he has risen over the throne, and God knows best. But Ibn Taymiyyah would add, we do know that God is distinct from the creation. If it's God, our nations cannot get to it. It is in fact a theological problem to assume that we're able to understand, and hence we arbitrarily affirm some attributes and deny others. The safest thing to do is to stick with the terminology of the Quran and realize that God cannot be imagined by our minds. Realize that God told us these nouns and adjectives and adverbs and descriptions and attributes for a reason. Let's stick with the terminology of the Quran without getting into the, but if you say he's this, then it implies this. Ibn Taymiyyah will say, no, that's your implication. That's your axiomatic principles you're deriving from the kalam or from the falsafa arguments. I don't subscribe to that entire worldview. God is distinct and above us, above in every single way, transcendently above us and meaning-wise above us, that we don't presume to understand these attributes except that in a manner that befits God. And let's just give you some quotes here. To also, sorry, one of them is in Arabic, or the student body that I have understands Arabic, but this is from Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Hanbalis, Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself. The Arabic is really key, and that's why I put it in Arabic, and Ibn Taymiyyah constantly uses this Arabic. So this is attributed to Ibn Hanbal, who goes back to 840 CE, one of the icons of Sunni Islam. Maybe you've studied his biography. And this phrase reiterates throughout all of Atharism, and Ibn Taymiyyah constantly, it becomes a maxim for Atharis. We only describe God by how he describes himself or how his prophet described him. We do not go beyond the terminology or the wordings of the Quran and the Hadith, and we will not distort, we will not negate, we will not affirm a modality, nor will we presume to know how it occurs, okay? So we affirm the wording without negating the wording or the meaning, without distorting the apparent meaning. Everybody knows what, life means. Everybody knows what it means. Everybody knows knowledge. Everybody knows hearing and seeing. We understand the concept. When it comes to applying it to God, we will ask our minds to shut down and say, God knows how it exists. We understand the concept, and then we apply it to God intellectually in a way that befits him. And the same goes for the attributes that are blatantly anthropomorphic in the minds of most other Muslims, other than this one strand. This is the only strand that will affirm the only existent strand. There were strands in the past that did this, and some were more anthropomorphic than this strand. This strand does not view itself as being anthropomorphic, because they say anthropomorphism is to say God is like man. We are saying God has life, and his life is as different to the life of man as he is different from man. And God has a hand, and his hand is as different to us as he is to us, right? And so they would always make these caveats in this regard. And the class that I teach is for Sunni Muslims. So there's a famous scholar of the books of Hadith called Tirmidhi. So he has the theological paragraph in his Sunan that is very interesting, because it's a very early doctrine of Atharism, which demonstrates, again, this is the view that I would say most academics would have it. It's not a sectarian view, that the early nascent Sunni community clearly was not pro-kalam. They weren't pro-falsafa. And the default amongst them was that there was this almost literalism, which then became Atharism. And so it is somewhat, academic to say, and I don't see this as problematic. I don't, maybe if some later speakers disagree, I give them that right. I don't know, maybe, but I don't think it's problematic to say that the default pre-scholars of Kalam, pre-Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari and pre-Maturidi and others, the default of the early Muslim community would be to not categorize the attributes at all, to affirm the attributes in a modality that is known to God, to not really think too deeply and to just, narrate it and let it be. And this is summarized, and this will be my final quote. This is, still 5 minutes left. Okay, sorry. I'm looking at the time here. So this is summarized very beautifully by At-Tirmidhi. And the reason I quote Tirmidhi is because he's an icon of Sunnism. He's one of the iconic collectors of the hadith, original hadith collections. He has one of the original 6 books. And from the Sunni perspective, or from the Athari perspective, by the way, the books followed Atharism. And in fact, according to them, all of the 4 schools of Islamic law were founded by people who had the same theology. This is a key point here. According to this strand of Islam, all of the icons of early Islam that were associated with the general Sunni movement are Athari in their creed. According to this interpretation, Maturidism and Ash'arism and Mu'tazilism are deviations that occur later on. And according to them, Atharism is tapping into the original. And of course, I mean, as an academic, I'll say that's a very simplistic view, but I'll still say there's a kernel of truth. I say this as an academic, even though once upon a time I was a part of that strand. You should know this, or maybe later on it'll be mentioned, but I'm no longer subscribing to that. But hopefully this is not my earlier biases coming out. I have a number of library chats online you can listen to. I go into a lot more detail in this regard. I think it is indubitably, proven that the mainstream, the bulk of these iconic scholars whose writings we still have around, clearly were affirming the attributes without thinking too deeply about them. So there's a kernel of Atharism that goes back to the earliest icons of Sunnism, and that kernel of Atharism continued to expand until Ibn Taymiyyah comes in, kind of sort of codifies it, and obviously develops it to a different level, which is always done. But I want to conclude with this quote that At-Tirmidhi said, after narrating the prophetic tradition that God accepts charity and takes it in his right hand. This is in his book. He goes, more than one scholar has spoken about this hadith, saying of the Prophet, and similar reports that refer to the divine attributes and the descent, that should be descent of the Lord. So God comes down the last of the night to the lowest heavens. They said, meaning the scholars before Tirmidhi, we affirm these reports. We believe in them, but we can't imagine how. They cannot be imagined, or even we don't ask how it occurs. We believe it occurs, but we don't visualize and we don't ask how. And this has been the theology narrated from the great giants, Malik, the founder of Maliki law. Sufyan ibn Uyayna is one of the icons of, again, the proto-hadith scholars. Abdullah ibn Mubarak, considered to be a great ascetic and worshipper and warrior, combined. These are the icons of the second generation, 2nd century. All of these are 2nd century, so 100 years before Tirmidhi. So all of them said concerning these traditions, let them pass through without discussing how. Narrate them. Don't think about how. And this is the view of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. As for the Jahmis, pause here, the Jahmis are the Neoplatonists of their era. Okay, so Jahm ibn Safwan, my entire master's dissertation was on Jahm ibn Safwan, 850 pages I wrote about Jahm ibn Safwan. And there's a nice article by Richard and Frank written before I was born called The Neoplatonism of Jahm ibn Safwan in 1968. You can find this online. And so these are the Neoplatonists. So as for the Neoplatonists, they denied these reports, and they said to mention them is likening God to his creation, i.e., to believe in these reports is anthropomorphic. That's what Tirmidhi accuses the Neoplatonists of. And he goes, that's not our belief. Who is us at this point in time? There's Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is later called Sunni Islam. Okay, that was a brief summary. I'm sorry for rushing over, and I apologize if I skipped over anything. But if there's any questions, I have however many minutes Professor Khalil allows me to, and then I will have to excuse myself earlier because I have another engagement in my mosque here. Apologize. I won't be able to stay to the end. So
sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalil. We really appreciate you being generous and doing this with us. So now is the time for open questions, and what we can do is students, you can write your questions in the chat, either to me or to the whole chat. You can also use the raise hand feature and ask a live question. And if you recall, students, I asked you yesterday to each person to prepare at least one question about each trend of thought that we're learning about today. So I expect you to have questions. So firstly, does anybody want to ask a live question, like on audio? You can raise your hand. It's okay, don't be shy. This is let me put it this way. It's actually pretty rare that you're going to have Muslim scholars from such diverse schools of thought in one Zoom chat to talk about this.
Sadly, that is true. I have to agree. We have to do this more often. But yes, it is very rare you're going to have.
So take advantage of this.
Yeah.
So first, just live questions. I want to just invite anyone who wants to ask live before I go to the written questions. So live questions, anybody?
Sure, I'll do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I already typed it in chat, but in your opinion, are there any drawbacks or kind of like hard to explain parts of Quranic interpretation that comes from following a Hanbali? Is that how you say it? I think I said that wrong.
Ibn Hanbal?
Yeah.
So you're asking me, are there any drawbacks in following Ibn Hanbal? Is that what you're saying?
Or kind of like drawbacks or kind of like hard, like areas of interpretation that comes with like interpreting the Quran and Hadith?
I mean, this is a really good question, and it's a really difficult one. Can't be answered in 2 minutes. This is a massive issue of discussion and controversy in modern Islam. It's not just Ibn Hanbal and his interpretation. Most of the problematic interpretations that clash with modern values are not from just Salafis or Hanbalis or Atharis. See, the issue of the attributes nobody cares about except internally, right? This is not an issue in which there's, angst and animosity. The broader public doesn't care if Muslims believe Neoplatonists or Kalam or Atharis, right? They are interested in blasphemy laws. They are interested in freedom. They're interested in these liberal values. And when it comes to these types of notions, I want you all to understand a key point here, which is mainstream Sunnism, and dare I say 12-er Shiism and Zaydism and Ibadism, usually tend to be in agreement on majority of these in terms of how they have perceived it, in terms of that's how it's taught to this day in seminaries. So, the blasphemer, what is the punishment for the blasphemer? I mean, that's pretty standard across all schools of Islamic law, other than the Ismailis, which Dr. Khalil will tell you about. But other than that, this is a problem. That many modern people have with the faith of Islam. It's not just Ibn Hanbal. And I've spoken about these types of issues in other lectures and details. And it's difficult to summarize because it is a convoluted topic. But we as Muslims living in modernity are faced with the challenge of trying to be faithful to our tradition, even as we live in modernity. There is no simplistic solution. Islam has a detailed set of laws. Islam does have a code that is meant to be applied at a society level. That code is no longer being applied at a society level by and large. So what do Muslims do living in the nation states? What do Muslims do living under secular democracies? These are very interesting questions. These are awfully debated. And I don't have an easy answer for you other than to say, listen and read and ask, and you're going to begin to understand that you have multiple ways of doing this. Me personally, I distinguish between classical law and between living in modernity. I don't try to back project morality onto my past predecessors. They had a different time and place. But I do believe that Islamic law gives us leeway in how we can apply some of these laws in the modern nation state. That's me as a Muslim thinker in our times have done. It's given me a lot of pushback from both sides. For some, that's too liberal. For others, I'm not liberal enough because I'm not going to, as I call myself a forward-thinking traditionalist, I'm not going to dismiss the entirety of Islamic law because we have different views of law and morality, but I'm willing to negotiate for our times and place. Yes, I'm willing to do that. Anyway, I hope that answers, but if not, then feel free to listen to my lectures and you'll get an idea of where I'm coming with this.
All right. Thank you so much for the question and for the answers. There are some written comments, questions that have come in. I'm not sure if you can see them.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Gone to me. So one private question to me was, what is one takeaway about the Hanbalis that you would like us students to fully grasp?
from the Hanbali perspective, from the Athari perspective, they are the Muslims who haven't been corrupted by the ideologies that are not emanating from within the faith tradition. They are fideists. They are scriptural fideists. They believe in the scripture because God knows best. And so from their perspective, the principles or the paradigm of trying to understand the religious texts via the lens of the Kalam cosmological argument, or via the lens of falsafa itself, is highly problematic. So God has revealed to us what he needs to know, what we need to know salvationally. Again, not science, not chemistry, not the computers, not technology, but salvation, the nature of God, the nature of worship, the nature of the hereafter. That's the purpose of revelation. So revelation is complete and it is perfect to convey that understanding to us. We don't need epistemological tools emanating from Plotinus or from Philo or John of Damascus to understand the tradition. That's the main point of Atharism. I have a question here. I noticed when you spoke about Muhammad, you would follow that with peace be upon him. That is a standard mainstream practice as a believing Muslim, not just an Atharism. And I am a cleric along with being a professor. I have two hats that I wear, and where possible, I do like to follow Islamic protocol by saying the Prophet, peace be upon him. And this is not just Atharism. This is mainstream Islam. Even 12 Shiites and Zaydis would say, and Ibadis and Sunnis would do the same thing. They would say, peace be upon him, as a mark of respect. So it's not just Atharism. What is the definition of bodies in the Kalam argument? Depends on who you ask. Professor Raymond is far better to answer after me because he is a specialist more than me, but it depends on who you ask. But one of the definitions of a body is a composite of atoms, because the way that the Kalam looks at the world is that the world consists of atoms. By atoms, they don't mean chemical atoms you guys studied in high school. They have this, Democritus back in the day believed that if you kept on slicing something in half, you would finally get to something that you couldn't slice. That something that you couldn't slice is atom, that which cannot be divided. And this atom is the same in all substances. In humans and in rocks, it's the same atom. It's not different chemicals, right? And so according to some definitions, a composite of atoms becomes a body. 2 or 3 atoms becomes a body. So would it be fair to say that the Athari group is focused on preserving the pure message instead of actually having theological discussion? I just find this interesting, as we learned about the Atharis as the theological group, and from what it gathers, there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for whys and hows, but rather that's just how it is. See, that's how they view themselves, purity. That's exactly how they view themselves. They view this entire discussion of God in the language of kalam, in the language of falsafa, as bordering on heresy. God is beyond these axioms. And Ibn Taymiyyah would say that this is a realm that the mind cannot even enter. It is beyond our mind, our rationality and imagination. And there's some modern Atharis, theologians and thinkers. There's some modern, really bright minds in the movement that are bringing forth Wittgenstein and his notion of theories of language. There's an article that was written, I think, in JSTOR there, where one of the practitioners of that school is basically, bringing in the theory of language as Wittgenstein, taught it, and basically said we can apply this to Ibn Taymiyyah's model of God's attributes. And so, yes, that is exactly the point, that from the perspective of the Atharis, they did, and historically, by the way, the first group out of these three were the people of Kalam in terms of sophisticated theology. The mainstream bulk of the Muslim community was not discussing nor even problematizing the attributes. The first entity to problematize the attributes were the Neoplatonists, were Jahm and Ja'd and Mu'tazila, the Proto-Mu'tazila, the earliest batch of the Mu'tazila. This is coming out of Neoplatonic thought. Mainstream Sunnism then responded simplistically by saying, what are you talking about? God says he speaks. And for the Neoplatonists, the education was unsophisticated, uncritical. The terms that they called the proto-Sunnis, one of the terms they called the Atharis and Hanbalis was hashawiyya. And hashawiyya means those who fling anything they can. Imagine an enemy is attacking you, and instead of throwing rocks and arrows, you just pick up anything, a paper, and you throw it. That's hashawiyya. From the perspective of these rationalist thinkers, Atharis were simpletons. Salafis were, level one, naive believers, going down the level of sophistication that the Neoplatonists and the Falasifa had. From the perspective of the Hanbalis, from the Atharis, it's blasphemy to go there anyway. And it's stick with the tradition, let's stick with the wording and not go beyond. Ibn Taymiyyah actually developed a far more sophisticated internal epistemology and hermeneutics in which he's trying to make a rational defense of literalism, right? Before Ibn Taymiyyah, they didn't have a rational defense. They're just saying, God says so. Ibn Taymiyyah comes along and constructs an edifice, linguistic edifice, hermeneutical edifice, a theological edifice. And he basically proves rationally, from his perspective, that to be literalist is actually the logical thing to do, in a nutshell.
I'm gonna, because of time, I'm gonna use my liberty as organizer to ask you a final question, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So I understand like the spirit and like the pious spirit of we stick to what the Quran and the Hadith say and we don't go beyond it. But then I was wondering, to my knowledge, the Quran and the Hadith, they don't say that God is mawjood, existent. They don't say God is wajib al-wujud, necessary existence. They don't say that God has a had, a limit, right? They don't actually outright say that God's attributes ontologically in God are distinct from another. So by attribute, I don't mean a verbal description. I mean the way the Kalamis see the attributes. The Kalamis would say that in God's essence, God's knowledge is not identical to God's power, which is not identical to God's life. So I was wondering, on what basis do Atharis make statements that God is mawjood or wajib al-wujud? And do Atharis go as far as the Kalamis to say that God's knowledge is in God distinct from God's power, which is distinct from God's life? And if not, then, can the Atharis really have a problem with the groups like Mu'tazilas and others who do not who identify, all of God's attributes? Because the revelation doesn't outright say that ontologically in God, the divine attributes are all distinct. The revelation just makes predications, right? You get what I'm saying?
Yes. So as for the first point, Ibn Taymiyyah mentions that there's three categories of talking about God. You have God's names, you have God's attributes, you have God's descriptions. And names and attributes are what are divinely revealed. And so a name is the ever merciful, Ar-Rahman. An attribute is that, God gets angry at, those who, commit murder, whatever, or who are tyrants, for example, right? غَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. That's an attribute. It's not a name. God is not the angry one. It is an attribute of God. Or God, for example, in the prophetic traditions, God laughs at, a person for a specific reason where he was innocently doing something and God laughs at him, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah would say these are attributes and we take them from the Quran and the Sunnah. And then there's something else called descriptions. The Arabic is khabar. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, a description of God is valid insofar as, so the description does not have to occur in the divine text. A description is valid insofar as there is no negative connotation that comes, and it is in conformity with the names and attributes of God. And the example that he constantly brings is the one that you're mentioning, and that is al-wujud or mawjud, that he says the Quran does not say that God is mawjud, but wujud is not a name or an attribute. Wujud is a description, and you can describe God. And he goes, descriptions are not inherently praiseworthy, nor are they dispraiseworthy. They're neutral. So everything exists. good exists, evil exists, everything exists. Existence, he goes, is not something that is inherently praiseworthy. And so existence, you may describe God as that, but it is not of his names or his attributes, because according to Ibn Taymiyyah, names and attributes are what make God God. Names and attributes are inherently praiseworthy, and they're the ones that the Quran and Sunnah has come with. As for your other question about the notion of attributes, being conveying different meanings, for sure, the Atharis would say that every attribute does indeed convey a different meaning. And that's why God's knowledge is not like God's hearing, and God's hearing is not like God's mercy. Each one conveys a different meaning. And these meanings are, now here's where you get to this technical language. This is where Ibn Taymiyyah would himself balk and always be, if you read his writings, he's always cautious to go where your statements are going, because obviously, from the mindset of the people of Kalam or the people of Falsafa, once you start opening the predicate door, once you start saying, well, there's composition and there's, layers of interpretation, then you will get to these notions of God being the entity that has accidents and therefore he's created. This is where they didn't want to go. And they said that you shouldn't be viewing God in the first place to be subject to these truths that you consider to be axiomatic. So they would, my understanding of Ibn Taymiyyah, they wouldn't like this type of detailed analysis. They would simply say, it's clear that when God says he has life, it's something different than when he says he has speech. And God has both life and the characteristic of speech. This does not mean that God is composite. This does not mean that God is compounded, much less that God has, a body. So they would negate that which Kalam and Falsafa would both necessarily affirm. After, I hope that's like, they don't want to get into this terminology or even the notion of what the implication is when you say that you have these composite attributes and this would imply X, Y, and Z. They want to shut this door down completely, and they would quote you the Quranic verse, there is nothing similar to him. Laysa kamithlihi shay. So they would say God's relationship with his attributes is divine and godly. Our minds will never understand them, and let's just leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yasser Qadhi. We really appreciate you joining us. I know you have things to get to, but you're welcome to listen in as long as you want to. It's a regret that you can't join us for like the post discussion, but it was good to have you here. And maybe I try to do these often to many classes. So, maybe you'll join us for longer at the next one. But if everyone wants to give a virtual round of applause, we actually have a reaction button for this. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, we are now going to move to our second presenter. Okay. Which will be a somewhat different perspective on this same topic that we're learning about today. So we have here Dr. Ramon Harvey. I'm happy to say that Dr. Harvey has spoken in my classes before. I teach an Islamic ethics course, and he's also an expert in that area. So I had actually had him join us for that a couple of years ago, and I'm really glad that Dr. Harvey is back. So Dr. Harvey lectures in Islamic theology at the Cambridge Muslim College. He undertook postgrad studies at SOAS, University of London. He also holds an Alamiya qualification. That's like a traditional Islamic credential. And he has published a book, 2 books actually. One is called Transcendent God, Rational World, a Maturidi Theology, and the other book is The Quran and the Just Society, both published by Edinburgh University Press. And his research focuses on Kalam in early Maturidism and on constructive Islamic theology in conversation with Christian theology, analytic philosophy, and phenomenology. And he's the editor of the Edinburgh Studies in Islamic Scripture and Theology. And I particularly brought Ramon here, or Dr. Harvey here, because he is what I would call a living Muslim theologian. So he draws on the tradition, and I'm sure he'll talk about this, but he sort of reformulates pre-modern Islamic thought to engage some of the modern debates, just like the discussions we had in class yesterday when I asked all these groups, tell us your definition of God. So we're privileged to have you, Dr. Harvey, it's very nice to have you here. And when you want, are you sharing a screen or anything?
Yes, I would like to share some slides.
Yeah, you can go
But
ahead.
it's a pleasure to be here, and hi to everyone. And I hope that it'll be a useful presentation for you. So, will I just have screen sharing credentials? I imagine I do.
Yes, everybody should.
Yeah. Okay. And then I want to actually start the actual slideshow.
Yeah, and you have about
Yeah.
25 minutes for the main presentation, and then we'll do a few questions.
Right. Let me also.
Just so you
I've
know,
got a timer ticking.
we're looking at the presenter view. We're not looking at the full screen view.
Ah, okay. There's probably a clever way to do that.
Yeah, I guess if you turn presenter, I mean, we can see
I'll
it.
stop the share. I'll stop the share. I will end the slideshow. I will start from the beginning, and then I will try to.
I think if you start the slideshow and then screen share, you can select just the slideshow part, and we'll only see that.
I'm going to try that now. How about that?
Yes,
you have it yet?
now it works, correct.
Okay.
So
Okay, so
25
I am going to present today on the subject of Maturidi Tawhid. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what that's all about. So Maturidism, as I said in the slide, is a major Sunni school of theology. In Sunnism, we have the often explained to be kind of two Kalam schools, two kind of rationalistic, discursive schools of theology in Sunni Islam, plus the Atharis are considered a kind of third school that is less rationalistic in some ways, or more fideistic, as Dr. Qadi mentioned. So you have the Ash'ari school, which is often quite prominent and well known. Maturidi school has been very prominent for a long time, but sometimes doesn't get the attention it may deserve. But it's associated with a tradition also in jurisprudence called the Hanafi tradition, and this Iraqi jurist and theologian Abu Hanifa, who's a very well-known figure in Islam. And it's also often the theological perspective is associated with the jurisprudential perspective. And so it represents a long-standing and very numerous school of thought. It's the dominant school in places, in general, in places, in terms of numbers, into places such as India and the subcontinent and Turkey and Central Asia and so on, at least historically, and even to this day, has a large following. It originated, the school of Maturidism, in Samarkand, with the theological work of a figure known as Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. And he is a 4th or 10th century figure, so it's early in overall terms. And I'm going to focus on his particular theology today, although it's important to say he has a whole tradition of theology stemming from his thought that did continue for many, many centuries and even up until the present day. But I find particular inspiration in the original sort of founder figure's thought, and I think it's a useful way to frame the discussion we're having today. You'll probably notice in the slides, I've got some beautiful kind of tiles and domes and so on. This is all from the region of either Samarkand or Bukhara, which is this kind of today's Uzbekistan, which is really showing some of the beautiful architecture and art that was produced around the sort of Maturidi tradition, even if much of it would probably be a few centuries after our founding figure. And the main overview for today is the school is known for its rational approach to religion, while retaining commitments to core doctrines of Sunnism, including an affirmation of individuated divine attributes. So it's kind of, to put it in context with what you've just heard, it's retaining a good deal of commitment to some of the core ideas of, we could say, the Athari perspective, but allowing a more rational theological approach and defense of that. And in some places, that will adjust the exact position. And it was held in this stream of thought that was completely acceptable. And in fact, that is the true, also the true understanding of religion. So the Maturidis and obviously the Hanafis would consider their understanding to be the correct understanding, and they would trace it back to this broader Sunni conceptions of things such as the attributes, and at the same time they would allow reason's role, and they would say that we have a reason for a reason, that we can use it to help us understand the nature of God and the nature of religion. So the presentation structure today, I want to go through the historical backgrounds, the arguments for God's existence, the divine essence, attributes and names, seeming anthropomorphism in scripture, God's creation and other divine actions. And this is this structure was obviously given by Khalil, who's sort of directed us to look at these areas. So I will try to do what justice I can in the very short time I have. Just be aware I have wrote a full book on these matters, and it's very hard to summarize it in 25 minutes. So the historical background, I would like to just talk briefly about al-Maturidi himself, his life and his works. He seems to have studied and taught solely within Samarkand without any record of him leaving it. So he's just solely associated with this place in today's Uzbekistan, Samarkand, a beautiful city. This is interesting because it's very famous from Islamic scholarship that scholars would travel around to kind of meet the best teachers of their age and learn knowledge, what's known as rihla, sort of traveling for knowledge. We don't seem to have any evidence that Maturidi himself did this. But on the other hand, this actually shows that there was a strong religious tradition within Samarkand itself. And there was a madrasa, or a institute of learning that he studied in and then eventually taught in. And so he did have access to libraries. He had many works to refer to, and his work shows a strong familiarity with his debates and discussions, both philosophical, religious, of his age, and therefore it doesn't seem he lost out in terms of staying in Samarkand. He wrote a number of books and smaller treatises in the fields of theology, a few works in usul al-fiqh, which is the roots of jurisprudence, basically legal theory, and an encyclopedic tafsir, which is a Quranic commentary. I apologize for the Arabic terminology for those who are not familiar with it. It's just sort of second nature sometimes. But this was compiled by his students. Only his major theological work, known as Kitab al-Tawhid, it kind of means the book of monotheism or something like that, and his tafsir, his Quranic commentary, Ta'wilat al-Quran, the kind of interpretations of the Quran, survive. So a few, two major works. In fact, his two major works survive, but we don't have the other works, unfortunately. His writing, especially in Kitab al-Tawhid, is theologically sophisticated, especially for his time, yet stylistically difficult. What this means is he has, a very detailed and interesting perspective on matters of religion, but it's quite hard to often understand what he's saying. Even his Arabic seems to show signs that it was not his first language. He was probably a Persian speaker as his main language, and he used Arabic as a kind of scholarly language in the way that maybe scholars in the medieval, in the sort of European medieval times would use Latin as a kind of language of scholarship without necessarily speaking Latin in their daily lives. I want to give you a brief map here. This is Transoxania. So this is like the roundabout sort of today's Uzbekistan. You have Samarkand at the top of this kind of sort of slightly deformed triangle. Balkh below that, and Juzjan, an area kind of slightly to the sort of southwest. And this kind of region here sort of represents some of the main influences and some of the main sort of centers of knowledge for this tradition. So it's kind of this area that I would say can be characterized as being a bit away from the kind of central lands of Islam. If we think about kind of Arabia and Iraq and Baghdad and these kind of central heartlands, or even Khorasan, sort of, today's kind of Iran, it's a little bit further, as you can see from here, not that far away from places like Kabul, Afghanistan, today's Afghanistan, and so on. At the same time, this at the time was a very rich area of culture and knowledge, and so on. And so this is the sort of roots of this tradition, which, as I said, eventually spreads much wider all over the Muslim world, but particularly in the kind of non-Arab lands. So this Maturidi tradition is often associated with the kind of non-Arabic speaking Muslims in these various places. My approach today, in what follows, in this very short time I have, is to reconstruct some of al-Maturidi's own views, sticking closely to what he himself thinks, but acknowledging my own interpretive role. As Khalil says, that I do have some more kind of contemporary constructive work that I do, but I don't want to get into all of that because it gets too complex. So I want to keep it kind of stripped down to kind of something close to what al-Maturidi himself holds, but recognizing that I am making an interpretation. Other scholars, especially given how tricky his text is to understand do differ on some of these points. So just so you're aware of that, and I'm getting some pushback from some others as well, and that's fine. So arguments for God's existence. So I'm going to talk about two main arguments. I didn't catch all of Dr. Khadi's talk, but I got the hint that he was talking about some of this. So I will summarize it briefly. I won't spend too long on these, but Al-Maturidi does not use a form of the ontological argument, which is the a sort of definitional argument that God is in some way a being which greater cannot be imagined or sort of inherently logically necessary. He doesn't go down this route. His arguments are drawn from observation of the world that we can infer from our senses, from our understanding of the world. And in this, he's drawing from a kind of sort of Aristotelian tradition, broadly speaking, to some extent, in looking into the world and trying to sort of observe things and make and draw inferences from the world. And he does have a form of the Kalam cosmological argument. Very briefly put, the world came to exist, and what comes to exist has an eternal cause. So the world did have a beginning, and we can infer from that beginning of the world that it can't have been he thinks there can't have been an infinite regress of past, an infinite past. He thinks there must have been a starting point, a first a moment of existence, and from this he thinks there must be something outside of time that is causing, and he identifies this with God. Secondly, he has a version of the contingency argument, a very early version. This is saying something along the lines, rather than relying on a temporal argument, it relies on the idea of a kind of contingency, that things are dependent, that the world and the things in the world aren't self-sufficient, and therefore they depend on a non-contingent cause. And again, this will be, he will associate this with God. So the eternal or the non-contingent cause is then identified with God through further arguments. And so there's other parts of argumentation that are needed to take us from the idea of this cause outside of what's within worldly phenomenon to understand that this is actually the God that, for example, speaks to Muslims in the Quran. The teleological arguments, these are arguments that rather than look at these kind of very general structures of kind of the whole world and its existence and its contingency or beginning, they look at particular or specific features of the world. They infer from this a powerful, knowing, and wise creator. So teleological arguments have this feature of, as well as getting to a sort of cause to the world, they also will tell you something about that cause in terms of particularly of this idea of knowledge and wisdom. Of course, power is there as well. So some of the teleological arguments are based on the observation of change and opposition in the world. So Al-Maturidi talks about the living thing that dies, the separated things that join together, the small thing that grows, and so on and so forth. And he sees these oppositions in nature, this change going on, and he reasons that this change in nature in the world we see would not be possible except for a wise and powerful creator who's making this happen, because everything has this kind of changing nature. And so we can infer, and also the kind of the sort of intricacy of its structure and the way that these things happen, it couldn't just be doing it on its own. And he argues, and obviously the arguments are more involved in some cases than this very brief summary, but this is the general idea. He argues that there must be a wise creator to the world. And he also sometimes makes the direct analogy with human created artifacts, for example, buildings and writings, that just as we see when we see a building, we know that a human being has built that building. And when we see writing, we know that a human being has written this, i.e. that things within the world allow us to understand intelligence behind them, artifact creation. And he thinks that this can also be used, that the world as a whole exhibits those features that allow us to know there is an intelligent and willing a being who makes a choice to create the world, a being who has intelligence to create the world, and so on and so forth. These are kind of classical design arguments, much discussed also in the Western tradition. Turning on to our kind of main event, the main feature of our talk today is the divine essence, attributes, and names. So this is this huge topic of Tawhid itself, which I think is really the kind of central theme of the seminar or symposium that we are engaged in. So Al-Maturidi understands, and so this is a bit more technical, so hopefully I'll be able to take you with me on this, but Al-Maturidi understands an essence, and we call it that, as all the essential properties of a thing, those aspects of it that cannot be lost without changing what it is. So an essence, and this is drawing particularly on ideas coming from the earlier theological traditions, in Islam, various thinkers, also some of the sort of philosophical traditions, someone like Al-Kindi, He's drawing directly from Al-Kindi and others, and he's bringing together some of the kind of rational thinking that he thinks can help us explain religion in a way that is still true to scriptural truths and to the message of revelation, but he wants to use this kind of theoretical machinery to help him understand things better. And so he talks about this idea of an essence. So an essence is something that, as I said, has it's all the essential properties. This will sort of give us the total essence of something. Something that, the essence of something is that which it cannot be other than this to be what it is. If you take away one of these properties, one of these aspects of it, it will no longer be that thing. So this is a very important notion for him, because he wants to say, in accordance with his understanding of the divine nature, that God is transcendent above such phenomenal change as we've seen in the world. So we've talked about the world is always changing. Well, he contrasts that to say, well, there must be something that isn't changing, that isn't moving, that isn't contingent. And this is God. So God is eternal, God is unchanging, and God is metaphysically necessary, not logically necessary, as we as I said earlier, not just from logic itself, but from pure metaphysics, that God is absolutely necessary. There must be God in existence. And so this means that all of God's attributes are essential properties. So every single attribute that God has, God essentially has. There's nothing about God that could ever be different, that could potentially be different, that could in any way be different. This is about, in terms of God's attributes, because God is eternal, God is necessary, and so on. So therefore, God's essence is identical to God. So God is not the essence of God, that of God is nothing other than that entity that is God. So hopefully the two kind of the connection between the two makes sense. But the divine attributes do have distinct meanings and functions. So as we was just being touched on at the end of the last talk, power and knowledge are not the same, right? Maturidi is very clear on these kind of points, that he doesn't think that God's power is the same as God's knowledge. He thinks they have a different meaning and they reflect a different reality in the creator. So this means that he does not think that God is a kind of single, simple essence. He thinks God does have distinct properties. These are these individuated properties or attributes that the Sunnis are really keen to affirm and will not negate. He thinks there's a rational case for this, that it's obvious that when we talk about God's power, we're not talking about the same things when we talk about God's knowledge, and so on for God's will or God's wisdom or other attributes that I'll come on to. But he also thinks this can be inferred from scripture, that when the Quran talks about God's knowledge, it talks about that, when God talks in the Quran, as Maturidi would understand it, about his knowledge, he's talking about something that from the context we understand. That, for example, God knows, every leaf that drops to the ground, God knows it. That's not the same as when God said he has the power to do all things, or has the power to bring back the dead to life. For scripture to be meaningful, we must be able to use our language to understand it. And so there must be a connection between human language and the realities of what Revelation is talking about, and how those realities relate to the nature of God. And so Al-Maturidi is really clear on this, that he thinks that, just as we understand language in the world and different properties that things have in the world, we understand for a human being that the human being's knowledge is not the same as the human being's power. Then by analogy, we can apply these things to God in an appropriate way that doesn't make a similarity to God. So now we get to the kind of main event in this sense, that is God then a composite bundle of attributes? Does God have parts? Are these attributes all just a bunch of parts, and God is this kind of bundle of these parts? No, and Maturidi doesn't think so. Rather, he says that one suspends knowledge on whether each attribute is God or other than God. So they are not, and so the attribute, so knowledge, it's not God. It's that attribute is not God, because God is more than that. God has other attributes, but it's not other than God. It's not something else either. And so what you basically get from this is a kind of suspension of knowledge of exactly how that is reconciled. He says that this goes beyond our understanding. So you can probably see a connection to what Dr. Yasser was mentioning about what he was saying, Ibn Taymiyyah or various Athari thinkers would say on this, that you say there is a point in which we can't go beyond. But I think Al-Maturidi gives a kind of, he does ultimately stop and say we suspend knowledge, but he does go a bit further in understanding how this all works and defending it in a rational sense. So I think he has a more technical approach to it, a more theoretical approach to trying to deal with this issue through this idea of waqf, of suspending knowledge, which he uses in various places actually. And then the result of doing this kind of process of suspension of knowledge, waqf, is that the attributes are neither dependent on him nor he on them. So he won't say that that God is dependent on those attributes. He won't say that attributes are dependent on him, but he will sort of leave it in this kind of suspended state of waqf. This is my understanding. Kinds of attributes. So I just want to go through some of these as well. Maturidi places no limit on the number of divine attributes, but he distinguishes between two main categories. So he doesn't have a set number. He doesn't say there's 7, as some the Ash'ari said, or some of the later Maturidi said there's 8. He doesn't give any number to them, but he does distinguish between 2 types. He talks about attributes of essence, so attributes such as power, knowledge, wisdom, life, and will. These are very famous attributes, in general, largely agreed on amongst Sunni Muslims. Attribute of wisdom, though, is distinctive. This is part of what allows and ensures the intelligibility of the world to human beings. And in some of my work, I've tried to explore how Al-Maturidi uses this idea of wisdom to kind of underpin things like objective ethics in the world and various other aspects, divine truthfulness, and lots of things can be said about this, which I don't have time to get into. So this is an attribute that not everyone focuses on in the same way. For Al-Maturidi, it's very central. And then he talks also about attributes of action. These are things such as speech. That's often considered an attribute of essence by others, but he does seem to think of it as an action. Creative action, which I'm going to come on to, and mercy. So God also has actions, but the important thing to hold is that both, or to understand, are both for Maturidi are eternal aspects of the divine nature, yet not eternal in their own right. So they do not have a kind of eternality attributed to them. They are eternal because they are aspects of the divine nature. And as we said, everything, the God and all his attributes, is understood as unchanging and eternal. So therefore, this understanding that God is eternal with his attributes is how we would frame this. So it's kind of tries to avoid the problem that gets raised, or how can these different eternalities all be somehow within God? Does that lend to a kind of bundle of eternalities or something else? So going on to the names, there are 3 kinds of names that he discusses. The first relate to our naming of God. And actually, this is kind of a sense where all of the names kind of comes back to, but this is the way he puts it. So I'm sort of following his breakdown. So we call God all-knowing, Alim, and all-powerful, Qadir. So these are created expressions and are other than God. So when we call God, that God is all-knowing or God is all-powerful, this name is something that we're applying to God. It's within language, and therefore it's not some element of the divine nature, but it does refer to God and it refers to something about God. But it's in itself, names are something created that are applied to God, right? They're names for a reality. Secondly, he talks about names that refer to the reality of the divine essence in particular. So this is talking about what we've been referring to as kind of God as, God as he is in his complete nature, or in his that, in his essence. And so, for example, the name Allah itself, or God in English, is a name that word, that articulation, that language that we're using, that's created. But God himself, what that name refers to, is is not created, as God is necessary, and so on. Also, Ar-Rahman, the merciful, the one, the existent, the eternal. The naming, as I said, is other than God, as in one, but the reference, what it refers to, is God. And so he doesn't have any problem with this kind of, these the existent, well, isn't in scripture. If what we mean is God, then that's fine. And then so ultimately these names are, he thinks that they are ultimately created things. Now there is a complexity if they are mentioned in the Quran, and the Quran is understood as God's speech and so on. That's fine. But in terms of kind of our use of them, our naming of them, they are something that are part of us. And then finally, names that are derived from attributes. For example, knowing, Alim, powerful, Qadir. So these are names that derive directly from particular attributes. So for example, God's knowledge, God's power. So again, the same principle is in play. The naming is created, but the attributes are real in the sense that I discussed previously. So hopefully that distinction of the names is clear enough. And the seeming anthropomorphism, so these are these kind of obscure verses and hadiths that talk about things that may be understood as being distinctive of created beings. How does he deal with these? Well, first of all, negates any similarity to the creation. Using the verse of the Quran, none is like him, laysa kamithlihi shay. This was quoted by Dr. Qadi. I think, again, you're seeing some similarities in Maturidi. And even, I would say, Maturidi, in some respects, is closer. He's earlier than many of the Sunni Kalamis, as we've been saying. And he's in some ways close to this sort of Athari perspective, but you can't fully put him in that camp for these various distinctions and differences, which I could elaborate on if needed.
Just 5-minute warning.
Sure. Well, yeah, I've been trying to rush through to get through it all, so I think I'll be fine. He then says that there are various possible appropriate interpretations, ta'wilat, of the verses and sound hadiths. So this means that you have these verses. So, for example, the famous thing, istiwa al-arsh, which is kind of like, literally, it could be something like, often translated as something like God ascends the throne, or God, but does it mean ascends the throne? There's so many possible interpretations of this idea of kind of ascending or rising above or mastering, or there's different potential interpretations for this understanding. So what he says is that whatever it is, it can't be something that is similar to the creation. So God isn't kind of a body that's moving above an object, and the throne is considered to be a created object. So God is not moving, God is not sitting on the throne, God is not in any way interacting in a physical way with the throne. But what does it mean for God to do this thing called istiwa over the throne? Well, there's different possibilities. It could mean God is powerful over the whole creation. It could mean that God knows everything. It could mean something else. It might mean things we don't understand. What does this verse kind of really refer to? And the same for other kind of examples of these difficult expressions. He says, well, we don't really know how to choose between them. Different possibilities. We don't know which one is right. So even though he in his Quran book of interpretation, he will give various possibilities. He will discuss them, but he will say it is said this, it is said that. But when it comes to kind of an ultimate theological judgment, he says one suspends knowledge on them. Does waqf? One doesn't. We don't have basis to know that. Certain things we know. We know God is. We know well enough that God is powerful. God is knowing. God is wise. But we don't know exactly what this relationship to the throne is that's being discussed. So we're able to talk about these different interpretations, but ultimately we don't affirm any of them. We rather suspend knowledge on them. So this is sometimes somewhat similar to what's known as Tawhid, so maybe similar to Tawhid bil ma'na or something like this, but he talks about it in terms of waqf. He doesn't use this word of Tawhid. He doesn't use this term Tawhid. He uses waqf, and it's consistent with the way he looks at waqf in other areas. For example, he compares the obscure in his studies, and this was actually a benefit of doing this talk, is I went and looked at this, and I hadn't done this before. I hadn't looked at this particular issue that closely, and so I did go in and I read some of his works yesterday, and I saw that he compares the obscure verses, such verses talking about the throne or talking about God's, potentially, like, often that's the main example he uses, but there could be others. He talks referring to these he compares this to what's known as the disjointed letters, al-haruf al-muqatta'at. You may have come across in the Quran that you have these kind of disjointed letters that start some of the surahs of the Quran. So you have, for example, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, Alif Lam Mim. So just the letter Alif, the letter Arabic letter Lam, and the letter Mim. They're just said at the beginning of the second surah of the Quran. There's lots of theories about what do they mean, and Maturidi lifts a lot of these theories, but his theological position is that we do waqf. We don't know. We have to sort of submit to some of the mysteries. So it's not to be, I wouldn't say that Maturidism in general is a rational approach, much more rational, I would say, than sort of Atharism. At the same time, there are elements and places, as I've been suggesting, where there is a kind of a degree of mystery, or a degree of kind of submission, or acknowledgement of kind of not fully knowing everything about the divine nature is kind of considered to be cautious and praiseworthy for Maturidi. So God's creation and other divine actions. So he talks about something called takween, existentiation, or creative action. So he understands this eternal divine action to be distinct from divine knowledge, wisdom, power, and will. So there is God's knowledge about what should be, his wisdom about, what is conceivable to be, his power to realize things, and his will to choose what will be. But these are all distinguished, or additional to all of these is the actual realization of something in creation, his actual act of creation. This is a separate attribute known as takween, or existentiation, or it could be possibly passed as multiple actions, creating the various things in the world. But he generally speaks of it as kind of one sort of one action, one sort of divine action. And this is the cause of that thing existing, the sort of direct realization of that thing. But it's not the thing itself. It's something that is eternal and with God. He argues, despite this, he argues that the created thing is not realized in eternity. It is created at its allotted point in space and time. So some people might suggest, oh, well, if God is creating in eternity, then the creation must be with him in eternity. He argues, no, that's not correct, because what God is creating is the creation. And for him, the creation, by definition, is something within the sequence of temporality. It's something that has a first moment in its own right, and it isn't to be, it's something that's, by definition, goes through change, and goes, through these, it goes back to this picture I was giving in terms of the arguments for God. He sees there's a reality to the world. He's seeing the world is a temporal world and a changing world, and he's trying to explain that with reference to how is that made, how does that come about, and he explains that in relation to God. And so the attribute that explains that can't kind of nonsensically bring things into kind of eternity. Rather, God has the power to bring everything in its own time, and he has various arguments for that point. And he also writes about other times of divine action, as I've said, speech, mercy. All of these actions occur in eternity, and insofar as they connect to creation, do involve takween, but they're actions in their own right. So God is merciful in his own right. He is he does speak in his own in eternity, but yet any chance we have to hear that speech has to be mediated via creation, because we are beings of creation. So conclusion, hopefully this is just about on time. Maturidi developed an original and powerful theological system. His approach to Tawhid is characterized by, one, striking a balance between rational inference about the nature of God from the world. So taking a rational approach to understand who God is based on observation of the world, according to his understanding. Two, commitment to the description of God within the Quran and the Hadith. So he is fully committed to revelation, and trying to read revelation in its most appropriate sense. Three, transcendence of God from likeness to the world. So that reading, that commitment, cannot violate this fundamental transcendence that God does have from being like or similar to things in the world. Where necessary, in order to sort of maintain this approach, where necessary, such as on the question of the relation of the attributes to God, as I was discussing, and also on the interpretation of the so-called obscure attributes, he exercises theological caution and suspends knowledge, and says ultimately there are some places to which rationality can't go, even if it can take us to a lot of what we need in terms of religion. And so thanks for your attention. Here are some sort of pictures of two of my books and some other information about where you can find out more about what I do if you're interested, and I look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Harvey, for sharing all of this with us. And I can see there was a lot of, I hope I didn't make you do too much extra work in preparation. I haven't seen you present like on all these points in one thing before. So I think we're lucky that we got you to do it here. If we end up uploading this, I think it'll be a treat for everybody. So now at this point, we have a few minutes to take some questions about this particular topic in this presentation. Again, students, you can ask a live question. You can also write a question in the chat to everybody, or you can write it just to me. And again, you had a portion of the reading on Hanafi Maturidi theology that I had assigned, although I had picked some different, sort of later Maturidi thinkers in the reading, but you should be somewhat familiar with the tradition. And now is the time to pose questions. So first, does anybody want to ask a live question to Dr. Harvey? You can raise your hand before we go to the written ones. And also you can send written questions. The chat is open for that. So I think, as understandably, people are shy to ask live. I did get a written question. I think it was just sent to me, though. And there's another one too. Okay, so let's begin with the private question that was sent to me. Is what Dr. Ramon is saying, is he saying that God's actions do not define who God really is, or is he saying that God's attributes are different from each other? This was sent early on in the talk. Do you want to begin with that? Maybe you can differentiate divine actions again versus divine, because you said both are eternal, right?
Yeah. So really, I think for Maturidi, the actions and the attributes are all the same thing, really. I can't see much distinction between the two in the way he frames things. There may be some subtleties, but the core thing is that they are all eternal. They all, that timeless. They, they all have this relationship. This way he sees them being related to God. This kind of neither him nor other than him. This feature is common, and I think really he's reacting to other thinkers in his time who were distinguishing between actions and attributes. And so he, in order to engage with these thinkers, he talks about both. But when what he says about both makes them really not much difference between them. And this is why in the later Maturidi tradition, they just add this, they swallow all of the actions into takween, into creative action, and they make this the eighth attribute of God, and that's just kind of sorts out the question of the actions under an eighth attribute. So the later tradition, I think, recognizes the way he's thinking about this and just basically gets rid of effectively gets rid of the category of actions by putting it all under this one master action. I don't think Maturidi thinks like that. I think he does have room for different kinds of actions, but they, in effect, they all define who God is, and they are all distinct from one another, and yet he doesn't think they make God into a composite entity based on his the Waqf position. So this is what I've understood from his theology, and God knows best.
There's another question, which this one's everyone can see it. I want to add a bit of context. So we spent some time last week talking about the popular Muslim concept of the Nur of Muhammad, right? The light of Muhammad, as the first creation of God and sort of manifest through different prophets, including the historical Muhammad. Also, we spent some time talking about Quranic verses on Allah, like the ayat an-Nur, Allah is the Nur of the heavens and the earth, which many people have commented on. So the question is, how does this sort of Maturidi view, does Maturidi theology deal with the notion of Allah as Nur, and does it also have room for the idea of the light of Muhammad?
So in terms of the broad tradition of the Maturidi tradition, some of these ideas are very prominent in that tradition, in certain manifestations of that tradition, that they would, especially in the later period, some of these ideas gained a lot of, especially the idea of the place of the Prophet Muhammad as and his light and the sort of so-called Muhammadan reality and so on became very prominent in some of these later traditions, in the Sufi articulations of the tradition and so on. In terms of kind of what I've been presenting today and Maturidi himself, both of these ideas are not prominent in his thinking. He will, of course, he may of course have elements of in his exegesis of the Quran where he comes across this verse, and he may you'd have to look up exactly how he talks about this idea of the light of the world. It may be about guidance and the kind of things you might expect, but it doesn't take on a kind of metaphysical centrality in any way. And the same for the prophet. So the Prophet Muhammad, he sees the prophet as a prophet, as a guide, as someone who is calling the people to Islam and producing miracles, and a very important figure in that respect, and with great honor and reverence, as is seen throughout the Islamic tradition. But there's not this idea that somehow that the prophet himself is his own essence is at the core of the creation of the world or something like that. As far as I've read or seen, there's no real trace of that idea in the prophet in the work of Maturidi. There may be something about a sort of light coming down, the prophet, there's often an idea of a kind of a blessed ancestry to the prophet and so on, and something traveling through the generations to go to the prophet. This idea may be there. You'd have to search through the text we have, but it's not prominent if it is in the Quranic tafsir. So these are interesting concepts. They are within the broader tradition, but not necessarily with the founding figure, who's quite early on.
All right. Well, I think we will we'll resume, sort of move forward. So thank you so much, Dr. Harvey, for doing this for us. And again, I know how much work it takes to go digging into old texts and finding answers to very specific questions. So we thank you. We're very grateful for that. So now we are going to go to our third presenter of this Islamic Theology Symposium. And that presenter is my old friend, Davlat Dadi Khuda. And Davlat is currently doing his PhD in Islamic philosophy at LMU. And his research interests are in Islamic philosophy, theology, and their relation to contemporary philosophy. And, if I may say so, Davlat is... he's usually our go-to person when it comes to Ibn Sina, whom I introduced to the class yesterday. We talked about Ibn Sina yesterday. So it's a privilege to have Davlat with us for this presentation. I can't really think of anyone better to talk about the views of Ibn Sina. So I'll just stop my screen share, and Davlat, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Do you have slides?
Yeah, I do. I'm just gonna pull them up here. Can you guys see them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Have to run the show.
Let me see. There we go.
Yeah. I'll give time warnings in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. Thank you very much, Khalil, for having me here. It's good to be here, and I hope I can, stick to the format you gave me and tell you guys something about what Tawhid amounts to under an Abyssinian or a Mashai. This is how the school is known in the Islamic tradition system. Okay, so this is going to be the outline of the presentation. I'm just going to quickly go through the history of the school, and then I'm going to talk about the two sort of founders of this school, or its two main spokespersons in the Islamic tradition. And then I'm going to get into the actual views of the Mashai philosophers on questions like God's existence, God's unity, God's attributes, and God's action. Okay, so as far as the history goes, basically, it begins with, you could say, the translation movement around the 9th century in Baghdad. where just a bunch of literature from Greek sources, Syriac sources, even Old Persian and other languages as well, scientific literature gets translated into Arabic, and that gives rise to a lot of intellectual activity. And among these sources, the Aristotelian Neoplatonic philosophical corpus in particular stands out. And it's kind of built upon by these Greek and non-Greek and Muslim and non-Muslim thinkers until it reaches two people in particular. One, this philosopher named Farabi around the 10th century, and another, which is our guy, Ibn Sina, around the 11th century. And they are the ones that kind of critically engage with this Aristotelian Neoplatonic philosophical corpus and create something distinctive that becomes the dominant philosophical paradigm, you could say, in the Islamic tradition. Both of these figures were from the Islamic East as well. Dr. Harvey mentioned Maturidi came from the Islamic East. These figures did so as well. So Farabi came from what's called the Khorasan region, and there's a disagreement about exactly what city. So some say it's Faryab, which is in present-day Afghanistan. Others think it's Farab, which is in present-day Turkmenistan, I think. Ibn Sina himself came from Transoxiana, and more specifically, the city of Bukhara, or a village outside Bukhara, right? And like I said, these two figures are the main figures, and sort of Masha'i philosophy, as it's known in the Islamic tradition, goes back to these two. And this school constitutes one of the major, if not the major, philosophical tradition, alongside a few others. And usually it's contrasted in the literature with another school of philosophy known as the Ishraqi school, or Illuminationist, founded by a certain figure after Ibn Sina, whose name is Sohrawardi. He comes in the 12th century. And you also have this other school that comes a few centuries later, 17th to be exact, known as the Muta'ali school, or the Sadrian school, founded by this philosopher named Mullah Sadra. Okay, so that's the brief history that's relevant to our purposes. Okay, so now let me move on to the actual doctrinal content in theology or philosophical theology. So the first issue that's of central importance in the Masha'i or Avicennian system is God's existence. And for people like Farabi or Avicenna, that's Ibn Sina, God is understood as a being whose existence is intrinsically necessary, right? And the proof for the existence of such a being in this tradition is not considered self-evident. So it's something that has to be established, right? And Ibn Sina in particular offers a very famous argument for God's existence understood as this intrinsically necessary being that comes to be known as the Burhan as-Siddiqin in the tradition. Usually translated as something like the proof of the veracious or the proof of the truthful, right? And this is one way he characterizes this proof in one of his works. He thinks that it's very unique, and he's proud of that fact for having kind of discovered it or constructed it in these terms. So he says that one of the unique features of his proof in particular, unlike the others which draw on kind of some feature of the cosmos, right? Something like motion, or perhaps that things are designed, or maybe the fact that they're unified somehow. He says, my proof just sort of starts off from the possibility of something existing, nothing more. And if you grant me that much, I can, from that sort of possibility of something existing, go on to show you that there must actually exist something that is necessary in its existence, right? So if you look at this last sentence here, he says that for even if, he, and that is God, does not enact anything and nothing manifests from him, it would still be possible by this syllogism or by this argument of mine that he be proved after we posit the possibility of some existence, however it may be, right? So we can then ask ourselves, okay, how does the argument he formulates look? Well, we can give it the following syllogistic order, right? Again, where God is to be understood as something whose existence is necessary. So it goes on like this. If something possibly exists, then a necessary being exists. Something possibly exists, therefore a necessary being exists. It's as simple as that. But of course, the premises are in need of justification. And he does that in the relevant chapters of his works. So, for example, for the justification of premise 2, that something possibly exists, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, draws attention to the self-evident fact that something actually exists, right? And so on the basis of the existence of something or other, whatever it might be, he thinks that that's enough to show that something possibly exists, because from actuality, you can derive possibility, right? But the main premise is, of course, premise 1 in his argument. If something possibly exists, then a necessary being exists, right? And here he offers the following justification. He says, every existence is either necessary or contingent. If it is necessary, then the existence of the necessary being has been proved true, right? And that's just the desired conclusion. So if something were to exist and we agree that that thing is necessary, well, he's got his conclusion, right? And then we can move on from there. So that's the first step for the justification of premise 1. But the second step is if I were to say, well, this thing that possibly exists, let's suppose it's contingent. Well, he says, then we will clarify that the existence of the contingent eventually has to end up at the existence of something necessary. And then the bulk of the proof is devoted to justifying that step, right? And we can see something briefly about the argumentation he offers for the justification of this step we just saw as follows. So he says, look, well, if something, let's call it X, possibly exists, right, then its existence would either have to be contingent or necessary. So he means to say, it has to be either the sort of thing that can exist and can not exist, or it'll be the sort of thing that must exist, right? Again, if we choose the second option, that is the sort of thing that must be, then again, we get our conclusion, which is the existence of a necessary being. But if it's the sort of thing that can exist and can also not exist, he thinks that this will entail that there must be a necessary being that it ultimately depends on, right? And so whatever the case, we end up with a necessary being, right? And just as far as our purposes are concerned now, that's what we understand to be God. Of course, he's going to build upon that conclusion, and he has a bunch of arguments for showing that, you know, this necessary being has all the traditional attributes that are spoken about in religious scripture. But the kind of most basic and fundamental notion in the idea of God for him is that of a being whose existence is necessary, right? And like I said, the bulk of his argumentation will concern this premise, which states that, you know, if there's something contingent, that it has to ultimately depend on a necessary being, right? So he'll get into like issues of self-causation and infinite regresses and rule all those out, and ultimately conclude to a being that is sort of outside all contingent beings as their cause, and which must be necessary, right? But I'm leaving all that aside. I can, if anybody has any specific questions about that, I could take them up in the Q&A. Okay, so that's the gist of his proof for God's existence. Next, Avicenna turns to God's unity, right? And the question of God's unity for him is divided into two sub-questions: God's simplicity on the one hand, and God's uniqueness. Okay. Uniqueness concerns the fact that, you know, there's one God as opposed to two. That is to say, one necessary being as opposed to two. Simplicity concerns the fact that this necessary being lacks any real composition or divisibility. Okay, and this will be important for him to prove. Like, for example, essence, attribute, composition, as certain competing theologies in his time held, right? And he has an interesting argument that becomes very famous in the tradition for this conclusion that God is an absolutely simple being that is not composed of any parts or is not structured internally in some way. The argument goes like this. Here's my summary of it. So let's suppose that God, right, let G stand for God, has some kind of internal structure or consists of proper parts, A, B. So he says, well, then either each part, that is A, B, can exist independently of the whole, or only some part can, let's say B, part B, or none can exist independently of the other. That is, neither the parts A, B can exist independently of the whole G, and vice versa. He says that if each part can exist independently of the whole, then the whole is not a necessary being, but it was assumed to be a necessary being. Rather, these parts that make up God on this assumption are really are really the things that enjoy necessity of existence, not the whole. Because the whole cannot exist without them, but they can exist without it. Option two, if we say only some part can exist independently, that means that the other parts and the whole can't, right? So really then this part B is the necessary being, not G, which is the whole. So, and that again goes against our initial assumption. And if we say that actually neither the parts nor the whole can exist independently of the other, then he thinks that this entails that neither the parts nor the whole are necessary beings, right? Because of this interdependence. But a necessary being cannot depend on anything. So that's the gist of the argument. Here's a passage from one of his works where he lays out the steps, right? I'm not gonna read through this, but I can come back to this in the Q&A. The upshot of this argument: two things: necessity of existence and composition are inconsistent, right? Something cannot be somehow metaphysically structured, have parts in some way, and at the same time enjoy necessity of existence. That's one lesson from this argument. And the other one is that necessity of existence entails simplicity, right? So if something enjoys necessity of existence, it has to be metaphysically simple. That's his claim. Okay, God's attributes. For Ibn Sina, divine simplicity does not preclude characterization by attributes of perfection, like knowledge, power, and will. This is because necessity of existence, as he'll try and show, entails such attributes. What it does rule out, according to him, is only that such attributes be somehow additional to the essence, right? They somehow compose with it. That's what he thinks is problematic, but not the fact that they can be truly ascribed to this necessary being. Okay. He gives us a rule for understanding these divine attributes in a way which preserve divine necessity of existence and divine simplicity. So he says here, passage T5 in one of his other works, it must be known that his attributes return or reduce to either a negation or a relation or a combination of the two. If then the attributes are of this description, then they, even if multiplied, okay, won't contravene divine unity, i.e. simplicity, and won't contradict necessity of existence, right? So all attributes of perfection will be sort of given this kind of account, an account whereby they will either be relations or negations or a combination of both. So we'll see one example of this for lack of a time. Let's take divine knowledge, which is sort of arguably the most important attribute of perfection for him. So in general, Ibn Sina thinks that to know something is to have the reality of that thing or its essence somehow occur to the knower, okay? That's his general account. Now, divine knowledge, he thinks, is he thinks that the following could be said about divine knowledge. That on the one hand, it's true that to say that God knows himself and that God knows other things other than himself, and in this latter case, that he knows all the immaterial things that there are, as well as all the material things, right? But given divine simplicity, this knowledge that God enjoys has to be understood as something that is identical to his essence, which is to say that in their sort of account, what this means, what this identity amounts to, it amounts to saying that God's essence alone suffices for sort of knowing himself, which is to say himself being revealed to himself, and also for all other nobles to be revealed to him, right? So when we then apply a name like knower or knowing to God in a statement like God is a knower, on the Avicennian view, this predication will be true of God's essence alone, which is to say not God's essence plus some other metaphysical item, like a property or an attribute that's additional to his essence, but which is kind of inseparably linked to it, right? Not in virtue of that composite item, but rather in virtue of the God of God's essence alone, right? And one might wonder, okay, what is it about the divine essence that grounds the truth of that predication, right? That God is knowing. Ibn Sina says that it's the fact that the divine essence is an immaterial entity. And this is ultimately a negational consideration, right? It just means, you know, God's essence.
And welcome to my YouTube channel. Jared.
God's essence is not
AW846.
Material. It's not a body of some sort, right? And he gives the following argument for how this negational fact can serve as the basis for a true predication which attributes self-knowledge to God. So here's an argument he gives for divine self-knowledge in this work that I quoted from in the previous slide. What shows that he knows himself is what we mentioned about the fact that he is one or simple and transcends having causes, that is to say, necessary in existence. For the meaning of knowledge is the occurrence of the essence of the object known as abstract or as kind of immaterial from corporeal coverings. And if it's established that he is one, abstract from body and its attributes, then this essence, i.e. the divine essence, is in this way, or as abstract, realized for him, right? And all that for which an abstract essence is realized is a knower. And there's no requirement that this be its essence or that of something else. For itself is not absent from itself. Thus, he knows himself. Okay, given this understanding of the divine attributes and as being kind of either negations or relations ultimately grounded in the divine essence, and in fact identical with the divine essence, what are the implications for understanding scripture? So generally, according to the Islamic philosophers, revelation contains different types of discourse for guidance, right? Three in particular: demonstrative discourse, dialectical, and rhetorical. In one of his works, Ibn Sina states the following as an interpretation of a verse in the Quran, 16:125. And the book, which has no falsehood, neither, that is to say, the Quranic revelation, which has neither falsehood nor before it nor behind it, which is the revelation of the mighty, the wise, spoke of the like of it, i.e. these three different types of discourses. So he said, call unto the way of your Lord, the true religion with wisdom, i.e. by demonstration, which is for those that can bear it, and by beautiful persuasion, i.e. by rhetoric, which is for those that fall short of demonstration, and engage them in argument with what is best, i.e. by the widely known and praiseworthy statements, right? So implications for understanding scripture: anthropomorphic language cannot be taken literally, but must be understood in a way consistent with what is known demonstrably, i.e. divine necessity of existence and its concomitants, like divine simplicity. So where there's conflict, according to the Avicennian view, between the apparent sense of scripture and what can be known demonstrably, one has to do ta'wil, or one has to reinterpret non-literally the scriptural verse. So like, for example, with verses that talk of hands, feet, descent, and the like. Okay, so God's action. I think I'm out of time though, so I'll stop here. And
You have a couple minutes if you want.
Oh, I do? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just quickly run through this. Okay, God's action. So on the Avicennian view, God's act of creation is eternal. He distinguishes between what's called essential origination and temporal origination, huduth zamani and huduth zati. Essential origination concerns this idea of just ontological dependence. One thing depending on another, whether or not there's any temporal process involved. Temporal origination also has this idea of dependence, but it also includes this notion of time, that something gave rise to something before which it didn't, or that something came into existence before which it was non-existent, right? And on the Avicennian view, only the former, which is to say essential origination, is essential to scripture, not the latter, right? And for him, necessity of existence entails another property that he calls immutability, that the fact that the God is changeless, right? And this, together with divine causality, have two implications. One, that we understand divine causal activity as constant, right? Something he calls faith. And that the world turns out to be an eternal effect of this perpetual or constant causal activity, right? And here's a passage from one of his later followers, which nicely sort of explains the key principle behind this idea. He says, every act related to the cause that combines all the conditions for efficacy must obtain. And in metaphysics, it will be shown that what isn't necessity from its cause does not come to exist, right? So there's this idea of God's intrinsic necessity of existence and immutability, guaranteeing that there's nothing that he lacks, nothing that he waits for in order to bring about what he is able to bring about. And that in turn has the implication that his action has to be eternal and not temporally originated. And from that falls, and out of that falls the eternity of the world thesis. Okay, so I'll stop here.
All right. Thank you very much. Avicenna or Ibn Sina is always tough for people to deal with. So thank you for guiding us through. So we can now take questions, either written questions or live questions. We actually have a live question. So go ahead, Erica.
Yeah, so my question is a little bit specific, and I apologize if it's out of the scope that you're comfortable talking about, but I would be interested in just your own personal perspective on it. So kind of the proof that you laid out for the existence of God is like very mathematical and almost just kind of almost like a set theory proof in real mathematics. And I was just kind of curious on your interpretation, or I guess your understanding of why just kind of traditionally people pose mathematics and science in a separate camp than religion, and sort of how that kind of plays out, especially in the context of this proof that kind of uses a mathematical way of thinking to prove the existence of God.
Yeah, so if I've understood your question, I mean, for the Islamic philosophers, like the Masha'is or the Avicennians here, theology as a science is a it's a demonstrative discipline, right? Which is to say that it's a discipline that kind of gives you certain knowledge, right? And anything that gives you certain knowledge is for them measured by is for them measured by, i.e. has to conform to the standards of logic, right? Including mathematics. So really what's going on here is that he thinks that this is just sort of logical, i.e. demonstrative discourse, but brought to bear on theological topics, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add that this idea that logic should be separate from religion is a very modern idea.
Yeah.
And there were a few Muslims, like perhaps the Hanbali Atharis that we heard from earlier, they may believe that. But for most intellectual traditions in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and even Hinduism and Buddhism, logic was always underlying their beliefs. So this was quite normal. And this argument that Davlat has presented it's 1,000 years old, this argument. So it's been around, but we just don't tend to learn about it. There was a question I got, and this was earlier in the talk. So somebody said to me, I am confused. Is the suggestion that something, and then God, exists the creation of the universe, or is this suggestion bigger than just creation? So Davlat, they seem to be asking about like the first premise, like something exists. What is that something? Is that the universe? Is it anything? Are we saying just God? God is that something? Yeah, I guess it's about this.
The first premise here?
I think so. The question was asked around this stage.
Something possibly exists. About that premise?
Yeah, so what is this something? Like, do we mean like the universe exists or a cow exists?
It could be whatever you want. It's unspecified. Something possibly exists, okay, which he thinks that we can get from this premise in the next slide, which is that here in T2, there's no doubt that there's existence, i.e. there's no doubt that something exists, okay? So if something exists, then it's true that something possibly exists. And this something here in T2, it could be whatever you want. You might think, okay, the universe, you might think only I exist, right? You might be like a solipsist or something. It could be anything. You might think chairs exist, the sky exists. Something or other. That's all we need. And this is one of the, he thinks, virtues of his argument. It's that it starts with something so minimal. It doesn't start with something like, there's motion, right? Like the Aristotelian proof does. Aristotle starts by saying, some things are moved or some things are in motion. But if you're like a Parmenidean, right? Ancient philosopher, for those that don't know, Parmenides, he famously denied that motion was real, right? So against like a Parmenidean, that argument wouldn't work because he doesn't believe that there's motion. Some other arguments start from design, as we saw in the previous presentation, right? That, okay, there are things that are designed or seem to be designed or seem to be ordered, right? But some people might deny that as well. They might say, well, we don't believe that there's order, or order is in illusion, or something like that. So Avicenna or Ibn Sina, he just says, you know, I start from something more basic than all that and much more simple. The fact that something or other exists, which you cannot deny.
All right. Well, we're short on time, so let me say thank you very much, Javlat, for that presentation.
Well, thanks for having me.
And so I had originally thought that we would have time because I still have to present my thing, and I thought we'd have time for a sort of panel discussion with the three speakers. But to be honest, I think by the time I'm done, like we've gone on too long. So I'm going to present the last presentation, and then we'll just call it a day, because I don't want to keep everybody too long. So let me do that. So I'm going to just set myself up here. All right, so it's my honor to be the fourth presenter in today's Islamic Theology Symposium. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I am Dr. Khalil Andani. Obviously, I'm a professor at Augustana College, and I obtained my PhD and master's degrees in Islamic studies at Harvard University. I do focus on a few areas: Quranic studies, the history of Islamic theology and philosophy, the Ismaili tradition, which I'll be talking about today, and also a little bit of the Sufi tradition. So I work in many fields, and I'm also working lately in the contemporary philosophy of religion, where I'm trying to represent some medieval Islamic Neoplatonic ideas for contemporary philosophers to consider. So today, my talk will be focused on the understanding of Tawhid, or the oneness of God, in the Ismaili Muslim tradition of Islam. And this just to begin with a quick review, because the class will remember this from last week. The Ismailis are a branch of Shia Muslims. Ismailis believe that the Prophet Muhammad's lineal descendants, a group of them, are infallible imams appointed by God, and the Nizari Ismailis, which is the largest Ismaili group, they follow a lineage of 49 hereditary imams, beginning with Ali. Now, in Ismaili history, there was also a tradition of Ismaili philosophy or philosophical theology, and the heyday of that tradition was in the period 900 to 1200, around that time. So Ismaili philosophers were actually free to use philosophical reasoning and arguments to construct a representation of reality. And the Ismaili philosophical activity was guided and overseen by the Ismaili imams during that period. And it continued in different forms even after that. And today, there is, by some people in the Ismaili community, an attempt to revive some Ismaili philosophical theology, which even the present Ismaili Imam Aga Khan IV has strongly encouraged. So a quick summary of what I would call the classical Ismaili worldview, which has been the most enduring form of Ismaili thought and history. So for Ismailis, God is the absolutely independent, unconditioned reality, and drawing on available knowledge at the time, Ismailis did rationally argue for the existence of God through deductive arguments. God in Ismaili thought is absolutely simple. So God has no metaphysical parts. God is unique. God is unbounded. God transcends time, space, and God is beyond attributes, which is an idea I'll talk about soon. Ismailis also believe that God eternally creates or originates everything, and everything other than God, everything that is not identical to God, depends upon God to exist, whether it is temporal or eternal. And one of the key ideas in this worldview is that God perfectly wills the creation of a perfect, eternal first creation. This is known as the first intellect or the universal intellect. And the universal intellect, which is the first creation, it emanates or produces the second creation called the universal soul. And it's the universal soul that directly produces the cosmos, that is the spiritual and physical realms that we inhabit. There have been many Ismaili philosophers through history, but the theology that I'm talking about today primarily is drawn by some of the names that you see on the slide. So initially, I would say in the early 900s, Ismailis were not very interested in arguing for the existence of God. They felt, God's existence could be intuited directly. But by the 11th century, it actually became commonplace for Ismailis to give arguments for God. One of the earliest Ismaili thinkers to formally give an argument was a thinker by the name of Kermani. He died in the year 1020. This is almost 20 years before Ibn Sina's death, but he's like a contemporary of Ibn Sina. And Kermani argued that in reality, if we look at reality, things exist and some things depend on other things. So he observes that dependent existence exists, and Kermani argued that it was not possible, logically speaking, that there are only dependent things in reality. He argued that all these dependent things, no matter what they are, whether physical or spiritual, they must be sustained and they must depend on something that is, or a reality that is absolutely independent. And that is what Kermani identifies as God. So he argues for God using what I would call a dependency argument. And this is similar to Ibn Sina's argument, but technically it's a different argument. And after arguing that there must be an absolutely independent reality, Kermani argues that this reality, which he calls God, is simple. It has no parts. It's single. There's only one independent, simple reality. That this reality transcends all created things, and that this reality is immutable. So this is sort of like the rational basis for the Ismaili view of divine unity. So in this view, as I said, God is absolutely simple. God is absolutely transcendent. So God cannot be described by anything that we describe creation with. So there's no likeness, there's no similarity between God and creation. And what that also means is that God transcends having real distinct attributes. So it would be inappropriate in the Ismaili view to say that God has knowledge or God has power or God has life, where these terms refer to an attribute that is distinct from God. So this idea goes back early in the Shi'i tradition, but there's an argument like this is offered. So let's say, for the argument's sake, that there is God's essence, which is God's self, and God has some attribute, life, knowledge, power. So if you posit this, then you would have to acknowledge that there's a relationship between God and this attribute. Either the attribute depends on God, and something that depends on something else cannot be God. It's a creation. So if you say the attribute depends on God, then this attribute is really a created thing, even if it's eternal. Or if you say God depends on the attribute, that means God needs the attribute, and God is not independent, and God is not really God. You might say that maybe God and the attribute are both independent, but that would be there are two gods, which is logically impossible because God is simple. And you may say maybe God and the attribute are circularly depend on one another, and that would also mean that God is not really God because he needs something else to exist. So this argument concluded that therefore God does not have any real distinct attributes. God is just one singular reality. And based on this understanding, Ismailis preferred to talk about God only using negative language. So rather than saying God is all-knowing, because that statement could be misinterpreted to suggest that God has an attribute of knowledge and that God shares in an attribute like created things, Ismailis preferred to say that God is not knowing and God is not ignorant. God is not powerful and God is not powerless. And these are both negations. The idea here is to negate the existence of a distinct attribute like knowledge or power that exists with God. So that's negated, but you also negate a deficiency from God. You negate the idea that God is lacking something that he otherwise could possess. So this is known as dual negation. And this is a characteristic of Ismaili theological language. And the idea of this negation discourse is to articulate in the best way we can in human language that God is absolutely one and absolutely transcendent over all created things. So this is a very common thing that you find in Ismaili works. And again, Kirmani, for example, says that, all that which we negate from God belongs to whatever exists in creation. So the intent here is to negate created qualities from God. God is free from and transcends the attributes which are under his creation. He is the maker of attributes. And that sort of takes me to the next point, right? How does an Ismaili philosopher understand the positive language that we find in the Quran? So, the Quran literally says God is all-knowing and God is living. What does that mean in this context? So Ismailis are not against the scriptural language. What the Ismailis are concerned with is the proper interpretation of scriptural language. So when scripture says God is knowing or God is living, the understanding that Ismailis take from this is that God is not the possessor of knowledge and life and power, but that God is the creator of life, knowledge, and power. Because if we look in the universe, we will find these attributes like life, knowledge, power, wisdom. We'll find them in the world. If we consider the spiritual world, we will find those same attributes in a stronger sense in the spiritual world, in human souls and in angels. If we consider the first creation of God, we'll also find these attributes like life, knowledge, and power. So we would say in the Ismaili perspective, God is not the possessor of attributes. God is really the originator of attributes. So we can say God is all-knowing, but what we mean by that is that God causes whatever is knowing to know, or God causes or empowers everybody that has power. God is living only in the sense that God is the giver of life. So this is how all the Quranic and scriptural language is going to be understood within the Ismaili philosophical framework. So now let's talk about creation. So God is absolutely one. God has no internal parts. And from God, Ismaili authors argue that there is only one action that proceeds from God. There is only one act that God does or God performs. It's not logically possible for God to issue 2 actions or 3 actions, because if more than one action proceeds from God, it would logically entail multiplicity within God. And that contradicts what God is. But because there's no multiplicity in God, there's only unity, there is only one act or one effect that comes from God. And that is the creative action of God, which Ismailis call God's command or God's word. And this singular divine action is eternal. So God's creative action is eternal. It doesn't occur in time because God himself transcends time. So the direct effect of God is also eternal. And this is often described as an act of will. God acts through will, and this is seen as like the most sort of efficient or most direct, the swiftest form of act, an act of willing. So you have God's act of will, and God's act of will is directed toward goodness. So it's called pure goodness. It's often called pure wisdom. It's a perfect will. And this act of God's will, it produces a perfect substance. It produces a perfect outcome, if you will. Why does God's will produce a perfect outcome? Because God's will itself must be perfect. And the argument was that if God's effect, if God's active will was imperfect, that would entail some sort of limit or imperfection within God. This is an argument that Andani, for example, gives. So God's will produces a perfect essence or a perfect substance, and together the divine will with its perfect effect, together these two conjoin, and they constitute the first creation of God. And that first creation is called the first intellect. So the first intellect, which is the direct creation of God, it is a perfect creation, and the first intellect must be perfect. It's not possible that the first intellect lacks any perfections. It's not possible that it's imperfect. So this is sort of like how Ismaili cosmology begins. It's the idea of the first intellect as the perfect creation of God. And if you go back to the earlier slide that I had here, here I've visually depicted this. So the first intellect is over here, and Ismailis believe that the first intellect does have attributes that are mutually distinct. And it has attributes that are at the most optimal level of creation. So that's the first intellect. In other traditions, the first intellect, this entity, is often called the light of Muhammad, which we've talked about in this class at other times. So this is just a visual of the first intellect that you could find in some Ismaili texts. I've just translated it from Arabic to English. And this first intellect, it's perfect as a creation can be, but it lacks one thing. It lacks ontological independence. So the first intellect depends on God. It has everything else, but it depends on God. So the first intellect cannot create another first intellect, because it cannot sustain its own existence. So the first intellect cannot produce a copy of itself. The first intellect creates a second being, a second creation, and the best possible second creation that the first intellect can make is called the universal soul, which I've represented here. Now, this universal soul, it's not totally perfect, okay? It potentially is perfect, but it contains some imperfection. Why does the universal soul contain imperfection? It's because it is the effect of the first intellect. It's not the direct creation of God. So what God directly creates is perfect, but the creation of God's creation, that has some imperfection within it. So that creation of God's creation, that's what we call the universal soul. So this universal soul knows that it's not perfect. It recognizes that it is imperfect, and that imperfection causes the universal soul to be desiring of more. The universal soul wants to perfect itself. It wants to become more than what it is when it's created. So therefore, the universal soul, in pursuing its desire for perfection, it acts, it engages in goal-directed motion or goal-directed activity. And this universal soul creates the cosmos, the universe of matter and form, the universe as we know it, as well as human souls. This has all been created by the universal soul. And there's a sort of a more complex explanation of how you get the universe from the universal soul. And it has to do with the fact that one aspect of the universal soul is potential perfection. So that is the cause of form. And the other aspect of the universal soul is deficiency, which is the cause of matter. And matter and form together, they combine to make the universe as we know it. So overall, in this worldview, I'll just go back to the earlier slide, the Ismaili worldview looks like what you have over here. You have God, absolutely one, absolutely simple. You have the first creation of God, which is the universal or first intellect. And then you have the second creation, which is the universal soul. And then you have the cosmos composed of bodies and souls. And this actually helps Ismailis go back and read the Quran and interpret some of those seemingly anthropomorphic verses in the Quran. So for example, when the Quran says everything is perishing except God's face, Ismailis say that God's face refers to the first intellect. God himself doesn't have a literal face, but this expression must refer to something in reality, and the Quran is a reflection of reality. So if reality truly looks like this, as per this diagram, then you'd expect the Quran to correspond with reality. So the Ismailis will interpret the Quran in accordance with what they can intellectually demonstrate about reality as such, which is sort of diagrammed over here. So the face of God in the Quran refers to the universal soul. Or when the Quran says God is established over the throne of God, the face of God refers to the universal intellect. And then the verse about God's throne, the throne refers to the universal intellect as well. Okay. The footstool of God that the Quran mentioned, that refers to the universal soul. The two hands of God that the Quran mentions, well, one hand refers to the first intellect and the other hand refers to the universal soul. When it says God's hands are outstretched or God created Adam with his two hands, those two hands refer to these two creations, which are intermediaries for the creation of anything in the physical world. So that's sort of like the Ismaili philosophical worldview in a nutshell. And what Ismailis did is they also related the notion of imam or imamate to this worldview. So you have God, the first intellect, and then you have the universal soul. And the universal soul is creating the cosmos all the time. So creation is a continuous event. And in the cosmos, the universe is trying to create the best possible world. And the universal soul is given guidance from the first intellect in doing that. So the universal soul is continuously being informed and guided and inspired by the first intellect. And the universal soul gradually is able to manifest more perfect forms of existence in the universe, including humans. So human souls are one of the highest developed creations of the universal soul. And human souls potentially can become reflections of the first intellect. If we followed the path of God and we perfected ourselves, we could become reflections of the first intellect, and we could reflect perfection in creation as far as somebody could. Therefore, Ismailis argued that while most human souls are imperfect, there will always exist in the world, because the universal soul is guided by the first intellect, the universal soul will always be able to produce in every era at least one human soul that is perfect, okay? A human soul that is a reflection of the first intellect on earth. So these souls are called perfect humans, and Ismailis identified those souls with the imams and the prophets. So Prophet Muhammad was the perfect soul of his era. And these perfect souls are the natural leaders of human beings in religious, spiritual, moral, and even political matters. So every era in existence, when there's a human species, at least one human is going to be a perfect soul, a mirror of the first intellect. And in the Ismaili tradition, that human who reflects the attributes of the first intellect at the human level, that is the Prophet Muhammad in his time. And after the Prophet Muhammad, that human is the imam of the time. So this is how Ismailis relate their view of imamology to their worldview. This entire system works in unison. And the last thing I'll just mention is this worldview situates how Ismailis understand the term Tawhid. Now, Tawhid, most people believe that Tawhid means to believe that God is one. Like, that's the very layman understanding of Tawhid. But Ismailis noted that the word Tawhid in Arabic is a verb, and it means to unify something, to make something one. So Tawhid is a verb, it's an action done by an agent. So Tawhid is something that humans do. But what is it when humans do Tawhid? What are we making one? God is absolutely simple. God is already one. Right? So it doesn't make sense to say that we do Tawhid on God. God is already one. We don't make God one. So Ismaili said that if you really think about this, the meaning of Tawhid, of making something one, it doesn't really apply to God. God's oneness is even beyond numerical oneness. So what's going on with Tawhid when we say we believe in Tawhid or we do Tawhid? So one way that Ismailis thought about this is there is a way to interpret the act of Tawhid as having a negative meaning. Tawhid can also mean to isolate something, to isolate or distinguish something from another thing. That's Tawhid can also mean that. And therefore, the act of Tawhid on the part of the human, it doesn't mean to make God one, because God is always one, right? Tawhid, from a human perspective, it means to isolate everything in creation from God, okay? In other words, it's to testify that every level of creation, from the lowest level of creation, prime matter, all the way to the highest level of creation, which is the first intellect. Tawhid means to recognize every level of creation as being created by God and as being distinct from God. That is what Tawhid means within this context. So Tawhid actually requires the human being to know creation. You cannot directly have knowledge of God in this direct sense, but we can have direct knowledge of everything in creation. So we recognize every level in creation, from prime matter, which has the least perfection, all the way to the perfect human, whom for Ismailis is the Imam of the time, and even beyond the human realm to the universal soul and the first intellect. So this is what Tawhid is about from an Ismaili perspective. When the believer recognizes the ranks of reality as created by God, he ceases to attribute to God anything that is incompatible with God's greatness or to make God similar to his creation. So that's what Tawhid is about. Tawhid is about recognizing what creation is and then recognizing that God infinitely transcends all the great merits, virtues, and perfections within the created world. And on that note, I will end. Thank you very much. So I can take questions for about 2-3 minutes before we conclude fully the program. Again, you can write questions in the chat or you can raise. Yes, Erica.
So you talked about like the first intellect and the universal soul almost as having like agency, more so I guess the universal soul as like desiring to become perfect in a certain way. So I just, because you use like words that kind of related to this like agency, I'm a little bit confused on what is involved in the universal soul and the first intellect. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's fine to actually talk about them as agents. The universal soul and the first intellect, they are not inanimate objects. They are spiritual thinking beings. So they are agents. They are conscious. You could even think of them as levels of consciousness. And even human souls, my soul, your soul, human souls are actually based on the universal soul. We are like microcosmic copies of the universal soul. So yeah, I would say that in this system, let me go back to the summary. In this worldview, the intellect and the soul, they do have agency. They are spiritual, thinking, intellectual substances. So to some extent, they have thought, they have, you could say about the universal soul that it has personality of some sort. So we can talk about that, but they are what you would call, they're still created beings. They are not God, but they are under God and they are fully receptive to God and they worship God. So that was a good question. All right, any other questions? You can also write in the chat. All right, this is like last call for any questions. I know by the time you get to the last presenter, everybody's sort of like tired. So, all All right, if there are no questions, then I will let me formally thank all our presenters today. Thank you, Dr. Kazi's not here, but thank you to Dr. Harvey, and thank you to Davlat for joining us. This went on sort of longer than I thought. That's why we're not going to do like our little post-panel discussion. But thanks, everybody. Thank you to the class for your patience. I hope this was helpful to the students. I wanted you to have a chance to see living Islamic philosophers in action, right? I think that was important. And you can, if you Google these folks, you could send them follow-up questions, right? If there's things you want to learn more about. Otherwise, I actually have to go pick up my kids from school, so I'm out of time as well. So that's it. Thank you all, and have a safe rest of the day.